This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. On the local news roundup, Democrat Dan McCready withdraws his concession in the 9th Congressional District race as allegations of fraud mount. Mecklenburg County's new sheriff, Garry McFadden, wastes no time in fulfilling a campaign promise on his first day in office. Area suburbs are in talks with CMS to see if tensions can be diffused, and Honeywell International has decided to relocate its corporate headquarters here. They'll get incentives. We get some fairly high-paying jobs. Our roundtable of reporters is joining us as usual. Steve Harris is here from WFAE News. Welcome. And Doss Helms, education reporter for the Charlotte Observer, is here. Good morning. Glenn Burkins, editor and manager, publisher of the QCityMetro.com.
Good morning. I'm all that.
And more. And Erik Spanberg is here. He is the managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal. We're all in the studio. You can also watch us on Facebook Live. Dan McCready will join us in about, I can't do the math in my head anymore, but about 7 minutes from right now, a little less than that actually. Before we get to him, Steve Harrison, you've been following this 9th District story really carefully. Remind us how all of this came to light, this possibility of fraud in that election.
So Mark Harris presumably won the race by 905 votes. Getting ready to go to Washington last week, the State Board of Elections kind of dropped this bombshell, refused to certify the results because of these irregularities in Bladen and possibly Robeson County. And then we have the situation where an operative in Bladen County was working for the Mark Harris campaign as running a very aggressive absentee by mail ballot operation. And you know, people have told me, several media outlets, I think it's pretty widely accepted that his people were harvesting these absentee ballots, which is against the law.
Harvesting means?
You help, well, first of all, you help someone, encourage them to request a ballot. That's legal. Mm-hmm. The ballot comes to their house, then you go back to their house and you take it from them, which is against the law. And so the question is then, is that enough to call for a new election? Were ballots other ballots tampered with, thrown away, discarded? That's what we don't know.
Okay. Yesterday I was reading also about problems perhaps in Robeson County. The Robeson County Board of Elections became alarmed, they said, at the volume of voter registration forms and absentee ballot requests coming in over the summer. They alerted the State Board of Elections to that, and that revolves around Democrats running an aggressive absentee by mail ballot effort. Did the board take any action on that prior to the election?
Not that I know of. What happened in Robeson is interesting in that Robeson had, of all the counties in the 9th District, the highest percent of unreturned absentee ballots. We're not quite sure why. Was this kind of an innocent situation where people got them and never filled them out, or did something else happen?
So yesterday the bombshell was that Dan McCready took to Twitter and other media means to announce that he was, in light of all this, withdrawing his concession.
Last week, we began to learn about shameful criminal activity, bankrolled by my opponent to take away North Carolinians' very rights to vote. I didn't serve overseas in the Marine Corps just to come back home and watch politicians and career criminals attack our democracy. That's why today, I withdraw my concession to Mark Harris, who's remained completely silent. And I call on Mark Harris to tell us exactly what he knew and when he knew it.
And since that time, which happened late yesterday afternoon, Dan McCready has been making the rounds of national television. He just got off CNN, and he joins us by phone right now. Dan McCready, welcome. When did you decide to withdraw your concession? What was the straw that broke the camel's back for you?
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good.
It's great to be on with you. You know, I was as shocked as anyone. I was as shocked as anyone to see the State Board of Elections a week ago decide in a unprecedented 9-0 bipartisan decision to refuse to certify the results of this race. I was in Disney World with my 4 little kids 2 weeks ago, and my wife Laura, and just watched in shock as the evidence of criminal activity and fraud and irregularities rolled out over the last week, not just on a day-by-day basis, on just literally an hour-by-hour basis. And, you know, I started my career overseas, Mike, in the Marine Corps. You know, I understand what it means to fight for this country. I understand what it means to be a democracy, and our most fundamental right It's our right to vote. And I just can't believe that right here in North Carolina, we have politicians who are bankrolling criminals.
Well, do we
North Carolinians' voices.
stop right there, Dan? Do we know that he bankrolled criminals? Do we know that he knowingly bankrolled criminals?
Well, the evidence does not look good for my opponent, Mark Harris, but there's only one person that can tell us what exactly he knew and when, and that's Mark Harris. And his silence is unacceptable. He needs to come clean, and he needs to tell the people in North Carolina who had their voices taken from them exactly what he knew and when.
So I'm hearing you say that you believe that Mark Harris, when his organization, the people working in his campaign, hired the Red Dome group out of Cornelius, who then subcontracted out to McCready Dowless in Bladen County, that he knew what he was getting into. You believe that he knew what was going on. That's what you're saying.
Well, look, Bladen County is a small place. These are small towns. People know who the shady characters are. Robert Pittenger, the incumbent congressman, is on the record saying he refused to hire McCready Dowless because of the illegal activity. Mark Harris hired the criminal, who, by the way, was under investigation at the time for absentee ballot fraud, to manage his absentee ballot program, seeing the results of the last two elections, seeing the overwhelming evidence of fraud in the data, hired him, and then Mark Harris liked his services so much that he recommended the criminal McCready Dowless to other politicians. So, I can't get in Mark Harris's head, but I think it's absolutely essential that he end the silence and stop hiding behind a lawyer and tell all of us what he knew.
So, Dan, this is Erik Spanberg. I'm curious, obviously, you want the end result of this to be you going to Washington to be in Congress, but how do you think this should be resolved? How should an election be reconfigured? What is the fairest way to resolve this?
Should there be a primary again in the Republican side of things? Should Robert Pittenger have a chance at this again?
Well, this really is not about me. This is not even about Mark Harris. This is about people who had their voices silenced. And your right to vote is your voice. It is our most sacred right here in America. And so this is about people. This is not about whether someone votes for a Republican or votes for a Democrat. It's not about whether it's a Republican or Democrat in office. This is a lot bigger than any one election.
But what's the fairest way to resolve that? What's the fairest way for everyone's voice to be heard?
Well, the State Board of Elections needs to do exactly what they're doing and conduct a full and a thorough investigation. And if that investigation shows that this election was tainted, then there absolutely should be a new election.
Well, let me ask you this, because you have a lot at stake in this. If they don't decide on a new election, but they do see that there's been voter fraud committed, and the margin narrows to several hundred, like 300, 200 votes, are you going to call for a new election yourself? And if there is a new election, whether you call for it or they call for it, are you prepared to run again?
The only thing I'm focused on now, Mike, is fighting for these people who had their voices taken. I think, and I'm someone who follows the laws and follows the process, and I think we have exactly the right process happening right now, where the State Board of Elections is conducting an investigation. And I just want to point out that it took a lot of courage for the Republicans on that board to join the Democrats and the Independent and call in a bipartisan 9-0 decision not to certify the results. Not only is apparently this is the greatest election fraud that any of us have seen in recent memory, but it really the Republicans on that board should really be commended for the courage that they had to do something bipartisan and stand up for people's rights. I trust the process.
We know we have to let you go, but I think Steve Harrison has a question. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Dan, this is Steve Harrison with WFAE. A question I had is about Robeson County. Had the highest rate of unreturned ballots. Most of them were from Democrats. Have your people kind of talked to people on the ground? Like, what happened there? Did people just simply not turn them in, or did someone take them for them?
We're trying to piece together the puzzle just like everyone else, and we've tried to do anything we can to cooperate with the authorities and the party and help get to the bottom of this. But it does appear that a lot of people had their voices silenced, not just in Bladen County, but in Robeson County too. And it appears that a lot of elderly folks were really preyed on by these criminals, which is just absolutely shameful activity.
Dan McCready, who withdrew his concession yesterday afternoon in the 9th Congressional District race, which Mark Harris, at least at the moment of the election, seemed to have won. Maybe not. We'll keep our eye on that. Thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Great to be on with you.
Very good. We made a request of the Harris campaign to have Mark Harris with us this morning as well. We have not heard back. The News Roundup continues on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. The State Elections Board has issued subpoenas, we are told, to the Harris campaign and to the Red Dome Group, which is that company out of Cornelius. They were paid more than $400,000 by the Harris campaign, and they employed McCready Dallas to be an independent contractor. He seems to be the focus of all the investigation down in Bladen County. What did the Harris campaign pay the Red Dome Group to do? Steve?
I think to win the day on absentee mail votes and probably other get-out-the-vote efforts. But
and nothing wrong with that.
You can get 100% of your votes through the mail in the state, and there's nothing wrong with that. You just simply cannot coerce, intimidate, and you cannot harvest those ballots.
Now, McCready Dallas is the fellow down in Bladen County that they subcontracted this out to. He was a convicted felon. He was convicted of felony fraud in 1992. Doesn't speak well to his character, but does that disqualify him for working in any capacity in an election?
I would say probably they're on both political parties. They're characters with, they're people working with similar backgrounds, at different levels. And so, no, I don't think that's a disqualification.
And he is the soil conservation officer or director or whatever the title is in that part of the state, right?
Correct.
We know what the what the law does not allow. What can a campaign legally do to rally absentee voters?
So I think you can go to their house and say, Glenn, do you want to vote by mail? And then I can be a witness as you fill out your request. I can go back to your house and say, hey, did you get your ballot? Did you get your ballot? At some point, you can complain that I'm intimidating you, but it's kind of just like a regular get-out-the-vote effort for early voting. When volunteers come and knock on doors repeatedly to try and get people to the polls, you can kind of do that with mail voting.
And I was listening to your conversation this morning with Lisa on Morning Edition, and you spoke with Dallas Woodhouse, who is the executive director of the state Republican Party, and he made he drew a line between illegal activity and fraudulent activity. What was that about?
So I think that's interesting because he's kind of shifted his position a little bit. Immediately after the election, it was, there's not enough votes to matter, let's move on. But he's saying now that harvesting ballots is illegal, and those people should be prosecuted. But he's saying that's not necessarily fraudulent. He says, I need to see ballot tampering, ballots thrown away before he feels like you can call a new election. That's just his position, but I'm not sure how much of a difference there is.
Well, he too has been all over national television in the last 24 hours, and he expressed his shock at this. But they've known, Democrats and Republicans have known that this has been going on down there for several years. When we come back, we'll talk about why nothing has been done. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
.org. We're waiting for updates for those folks that just called in a few moments ago. As best that we can tell, we're $1,316 away from meeting our goal of raising $19,000 for the morning. Can you call in and give us a portion of that right now? Maybe do $10 or $20 per month at 704-549-9000 or contributing at WFAE.org.
If you have yet to give,
Thank
you for that call. If you have yet to give this membership campaign, now is the time for you to step up and do that. As We are trying to come to the near the end of this campaign. We're in the last few days. It's vitally, hopefully, it's vitally important that we hear from you to make it the last few days. If we don't hear from you, we may have to extend it 704-549-9000 or WFAE.org. A gift in any amount. We're not asking you to break the bank. We are asking you just to take a look at your budget and figure out a price that works for you, perhaps on a monthly basis. If you can afford to do $5 a month, just $5 a month, we will gladly take that money and turn it into great conversations on Charlotte Talks in the future. And you will be the recipients of that every time you turn on the radio.
These important conversations like what you are hearing right now on the weekly news roundup, are made possible through our fundraising campaigns. The majority of our support comes to us from our listeners.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded, 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. It's the local news roundup, and that is why Steve Harrison from WFAE News is here, along with Ann Doss Helms from the Charlotte Observer, Glenn Burkins from QCityMetro.com, and Erik Spanberg, managing editor of the Charlotte Business Journal, who will be hosting this program on Monday, in fact. So this situation down in Bladen County with I guess it's the harvesting of ballots and absentee ballots shenanigans has been going on for several years, and it has impacted, evidently, both Democrats and Republicans, and they knew about it. It was referred to the U.S. attorney for that district in North Carolina 2 years ago, and nothing ever happened. Why? This is a federal crime.
Right, and I think that's kind of a big mystery today as to on all sides why now we've kind of risen this fever pitch in terms of what's been happening. 2 years ago, the allegations were about a Democratic-leaning group in Bladen County that was kind of helping people write in a certain name for water and soil commissioner. The state did they did do an investigation, but when you kind of read through the transcript, it did not have the same kind of intensity.
But the water and soil commissioner is McCready. That's
right.
Is he a Democrat or a Republican?
You know, I'm not sure of his registration, but he was running. I know he used to vote in Democratic primaries. Yeah. It was just fascinating. McCready made the complaint 2 years ago, and that the Democrats were running this operation. So it's kind of a takes one to know one situation. And then Pat McCrory's campaign kind of piggybacked on McCready Dallas's campaign because he was in such a close race for governor. And there just was not a particular interest in
and Pat
fixing
McCrory
this.
has alluded to the fact that perhaps if they had done something about this, he would have beaten Roy Cooper in the last election. Could that be true? I mean, was it that tight?
There weren't enough votes in Bladen County to make a difference in the McCrory-Cooper race. What McCrory wanted was kind of to use Bladen as an entry point for a broader statewide fraud investigation.
Just on the broader question, I think that something that we're all aware of as journalists is that it is harder to prove something has happened than to hear rumors about it. So I think it's legitimate that there is some investigative time between, everybody knows something's going on in Bladen County and, either we can go to press or we can bring criminal charges.
What's the evidence?
Right. The question is, has this been a reasonable amount of time?
Going to that point, Steve, you were there earlier this week. Did you talk with anyone who said he or she had been interviewed by the FBI?
No.
Steve, when I saw you yesterday, one of the things that I mentioned that continues to baffle me about this, there's so many questions, but one is I go back to the primary. Now, Robert Pittenger lost to Harris by 828 votes. Pittenger, as Dan McCready said, is on record saying that there were questionable things going on in Bladen County. You have a three-term incumbent congressman. I would just assume with staff and the way things work in politics, they would have dug into this. I don't understand why they haven't gone after this.
Well, but
in
if
a
you're
more
the
aggressive
Republican
manner.
Party and you're looking at maybe admitting that something's stinky about the guy who just won your primary and having that become the narrative versus please be quiet and and there's some it's all sort of subtle, but there seems to be
there was a,
some talk about that's how that sort of played out.
And I don't know that you can draw a direct line to this, but MSNBC is reporting that Mark Harris's 28-year-old son, John, works in the U.S. District Attorney's office as an assistant U.S. attorney, and they say that is according to the North Carolina State Bar. Don't know that you can draw conclusions from that, but it is an interesting anecdote. The more you hear about this, though, with the back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in Bladen County and winning and losing because of fraudulent activities, these people don't appear to be political about this. This appears to be mercenary. They're doing this, they're playing for the highest amount of money.
Well, certainly, I think, and Steve, I'm sure you probably heard this while you were on the ground there, but when you see some of the interviews like Joe Bruno from WSOC did, it was almost a matter of fact, so-and-so asked me to do this, so I did it.
Joe Bruno from WSOC TV spoke to a woman named Ginger Eason in Bladen County. She says that McCready Dallas paid her $75 to $100 a week to retrieve absentee ballots, and instead of mailing the ballots, she gave them to Dallas.
All the people who voted, did their votes count?
I guess. Like I said, I don't know nothing what happened after I dropped them off. Look.
So you don't know with certainty whether they were sent to the elections office?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I don't know. I dropped them off. What they do, that's on them.
So it's about money and no morals whatsoever. What are the rules about who can deliver and who can pick up absentee ballots?
So it is you or a close family member can deliver them.
Okay.
I think if there's a situation where if you were disabled and simply cannot, there can be an exception. But there's this chain of custody that if I hand my ballot off to Glenn or Erik and they take it to the post office, that is not allowed. Although it is allowed in some places. I think you can do that in California.
Now, you spoke, Steve, with several other Bladen County residents. Beverly Tyler told you volunteers from the Harris campaign signed up residents to vote by mail and then came back later to pick up their ballots.
She come back and got it, and I don't know, I hadn't voted in a long time, and I didn't know nothing about voting, and I weren't going to do it, but, of course, people make it sound important, so, but I don't know nothing about the person, but I put two and two together when I seen the news.
Explain to me what she just said.
So her first comment was, they came back and got it, meaning the absentee ballot,
okay,
and that they had, signed her up to request one days earlier, and then, if you're McCready Dallas and you're running an absentee ballot operation, it's going to drive you crazy to trust people to send them in. You're going to want to bring them into your office and put them in stacks and say, we've got this many white Republicans, this many unaffiliated. He's going to keep a tally every day of where he stands.
We're talking about one district in one state, North Carolina, 9th. I think we have to look at this from a broader perspective as well. There are races still being decided because they were so close. There was one called yesterday in California. There were tight races in Florida. There were tight races in Georgia, all over. As these races become tighter, it will become increasingly easier for this kind of thing to swing an election. We all like to believe that our system works, but there is the potential for fraud to really change outcomes in some of these tight races.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say real quickly, again, we've had all this debate, and this week there was a vote in North Carolina on voter ID policy. We've gone around and around about voter ID when the evidence, the preponderance of evidence has always pointed toward weakness and vulnerability in absentee voting.
Because the voter ID will not do anything to solve what we're talking about here today. And in fact, there has been absolutely no evidence of people coming to the polls to vote when they shouldn't be voting, or voting as somebody else.
But that's where all the political effort and debate has gone.
Do you think that's deliberate? Because they know this kind
Absolutely,
of
it's deliberate. Absolutely, it's deliberate.
Wait a minute, a deliberate deflection or a deliberate because they just want to make it harder for black people and poor people to vote?
This is about voter ID has always been about voter suppression, making it difficult for certain groups to vote. I stand by that. I think there is clear evidence of that. If there were the legitimate concern about voter fraud, the first place you would start looking is absentee. You would not start with voter ID. There is scant evidence that people are showing up voting in someone else's name.
And the other thing we've been hearing about this is people who are saying that they were told incorrectly that you've been removed from registration and now you have to re-register. And I don't know what that's all about. Maybe some of you have been covering it. Is that, again, a voter suppression? Is that a somehow making sure that they have their hands on your ballot?
And that was I heard about that in Robeson County, and the chair of the elections board, his view was that people were so aggressive, the young people, the operatives, were so aggressive in trying to get people signed up. They were just like, I don't know if it was so much deliberate, they were just double registering people because they're probably getting paid by the signatures. So their elections office got overwhelmed, sometimes with like duplicate registrations.
There you go, paid by the signature, paid to deliver, paid to pick up. Maybe we should make it a law that you can't pay anybody for that kind of activity. It should all be volunteers.
I don't think politicians are going to pay to outlaw political operations.
Going back,
yesterday, our colleague and a frequent member of this panel, WBTV's Nick Oxner, reported that records released by the North Carolina State Board of Elections this week and campaign finance reports point to a third coordinated effort surrounding absentee ballots in the county's 2018 elections. BTV obtained a page of handwritten notes showing another scheme to pay people in exchange for collecting unsealed absentee ballots. Nick's not here this morning. What do we know about that?
So that is a group called the Bladen Improvement Association. That is the Democratic-leaning group that was investigated 2 years ago. And so, yeah, when you look at the records of who brought in request forms, some of their paid people brought them in by the dozens. Not as many as McCready's group, but they were also getting people to vote by mail aggressively.
I think to go back to Glenn's point, though, beyond trying to sort all this out and how it is ultimately resolved, the big danger here is, again, you have this loss of faith and confidence and belief in an institution. And so you have voters all of a sudden wondering if their votes count, if it's fair in any way, and then it turns into a bigger muddle, by the way, in a country where voting rates are not very good to begin with, voter participation rates, I should say.
And it's interesting, I'll just say one more thing, like with the whole absentee by mail issue, that's the problem. That's kind of the direction a lot of states are going in overall. Like if you look out west, this is standard procedure for everyone. So
isn't it Oregon that has nothing but mail-in ballots?
I think so. I just know, you always hear about these returns coming in from Congress that just take so long out west because the mail keeps trickling in.
The State Board of Elections will hold a hearing on or before December 21st on possible vote tampering. What will they be looking at or deciding that we don't already know? I mean, what will they be looking at that we don't already know about this situation?
Well, I think they'd be looking to say, does this meet the standard for calling for a new election? Should we go ahead and certify and say this is really bad, we need to examine the system, but we feel pretty solid about this result? Or do they say this meets that standard of raising doubts about the integrity of the election?
And Steve pointed out that some have talked about the difference between fraud and illegality. I would think that they would also be trying to determine was this illegal behavior or was it fraudulent behavior? And if it was fraudulent behavior, was it extensive enough to actually influence the outcome?
I'm sorry, I was just going to say one more thing. I think the big thing they will be trying to find voters, as we all are, did you vote by absentee? Yes. Did you hand your vote over to someone? And they're going to be looking for the people where the ballot never came back. Okay. That's the key. That is kind of the key thing.
So Mark Harris on election night won this thing by at least 900 votes. Is the vote count in question in Bladen County big enough that he may not really have won this race, or is it just so murky right now that we have no way of telling?
If you take away all of his absentee mail votes in Bladen and Robeson County, he still wins or is still ahead by about 100 votes maybe. The question will be, what about these potential votes maybe that were intercepted and never made it?
So Mark Harris has said absolutely nothing about this. The Mark Harris campaign, to the best of my knowledge, has said absolutely nothing about this. We tried to get him on this morning. We did not receive a return call. Speculate. Why are we hearing nothing from the Mark Harris campaign? We're certainly hearing from the Republican Party about this.
Pure speculation would be that whatever you say is probably not going to do you a lot of good at this point. Wait until it is sorted out in a little more of a defined manner, and in the meantime, let Republican surrogates speak and on your behalf.
So we're in kind of uncharted territory, if I'm not mistaken. Has this ever happened anywhere? I mean, anywhere in the country?
I don't know, but I was going to mention, as you were asking about what happens on the 21st, remember, and this might be on your list to come, there's the whole congressional piece, because we heard Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi speaking this week.
They're not going to seat anybody.
Well, and remember, Congress would have ultimate authority if they decide to push this in whatever direction they want to push it in.
They'll investigate it too.
Right, and there are different standards in terms of a new election process when the state does it versus if Congress did it.
Everyone's saying we're in uncharted territory. I just said it, and the possible outcome could be a new election. Would it just be in Bladen County, in Robeson County, or would it be district-wide?
So I talked yesterday to a former member of the Board of Elections, and she kind of threw out this idea. I mean, in her view, now she's not on the board anymore, she said you could do it in just those two counties. She said you could also do it, just rerun the mail election. You would have the list of people who requested them. You'd send them ballots again and have them vote again.
And the other question, if it is district-wide, would it be under the same rules, or would it be under voter ID, which is now the law in North Carolina?
It's the local news roundup on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. In Congress, Virginia Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly has called for a House committee hearing on this race before the end of the year while the Republicans are still in control. He's also calling for outgoing Congressman Republican Trey Gowdy from South Carolina to hold an emergency hearing to understand what happened. Is that likely to happen?
My guess would be no, but I've been so wrong about so many predictions in recent years in politics. Maybe there will be.
Wow. So you report, Steve, that the epicenter of this is in Bladen County, specifically the small town of Bladensboro, population 1,700. And you say it is arguably, quote, the most civic engaged places in North Carolina, judging by how many people voted by absentee ballots. Your tongue firmly implanted in your cheek there. Clearly, something is fishy here. Why has this area been susceptible to this kind of activity over and over
McCready
and over?
Dallas lives in Bladenboro or just outside of it. So that's where he is. That's closest to home. That's where his people are who get absentee ballots. So Bladen County's the main part of it, and then even the main part of it is in this little town at the edge of the county.
Wow. So time is of the essence here because the Congress is seated on January 3rd.
Right.
Which is less than a month away. Steny Hoyer, as you pointed out, from Maryland, has and Nancy Pelosi, the presumptive Speaker of the House when the Democrats take over, say they will not seat Mark Harris until this is resolved. So how quickly can they resolve this? Will this district be without representation in Congress for a considerable amount of time?
Well, that's one thing that I'm really curious about in terms of if it's going through a state process with a state elections board and you have that fighting, you could obviously have all kinds of legal maneuvering. If Congress takes over, it's a lot harder to sue Congress.
Right.
And so that's really one of the big questions for me is how long does this stay under state control before Congress may act? And based on what you heard from a couple of Democratic leaders, they're obviously keeping a very close eye on this. And when you think about how bitterly partisan things are, I would just think that Congress is going to jump in sooner rather than later.
Well, there is other news, which we will get to when we come back from the break. There's a new sheriff in town. George Dunlap is the new head of the county commission, and Honeywell chooses Charlotte despite the fact that Amazon did not. We're coming right back.
9000 or WFAE.org with your phone call. Still waiting to update the board here. Still raising $588 here in the next 20 minutes. We'll reach our goal if we raise $588 here in the next 20 minutes. You can help us with that, and can we hear from you right now to get us started? 704-549-9000.
Today's Charlotte Talks Weekly News Roundup, a very important conversation, certainly as we talk about what's going on down in the 9th Congressional District and the controversy there around the vote that occurred last month. hoping to continue to bring you high-quality, insightful conversations like this in the future. Our ability to do so, though, relies upon the success of these fundraising campaigns. $588 away from raising $19,000 for the morning. Can you be a part of this with your call and your contribution now at 704-549-9000 or at WFAE.org? I'm going to thank Gene also, who made a contribution here just a few moments ago.
Going back into the program here in less than 20 seconds. The phone lines will still be open, though, as the conversation is going on. So you're still welcome to call and talk to one of our operators at 704-549-9000, or you can go online and make your contribution there as the conversation continues. WFAE.org, thanks for your support. Can we hear from you right now? Thanks.
It's the local news roundup on 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE in Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. Glenn Burkins is here from Q City Metro. Erik Spanberg from the Charlotte Business Journal and Doss Helms from the Charlotte Observer, and Steve Harrison from WFAE News. Garry McFadden, former CMPD detective, was sworn in as the new Mecklenburg County Sheriff this week. He wasted no time on that first day in office in following through with a campaign promise. He put ICE on ice. He ended the county's voluntary 287G agreement. That decision takes effect immediately. Remind folks what that 287G agreement does.
Well, in essence, it allowed immigration authorities, federal immigration authorities, to go into the prisons and detain inmates beyond the time they might normally be detained for purposes of starting a deportation hearing.
And the previous sheriff, Mr. Carmichael, would allow his deputies to ask, are you here legally? And
Correct.
if the answer is no, they would turn your name over to immigration, ICE, whatever that acronym is.
Exactly. And where you and I might be able to bail out for a minor offense or whatever, right. If you were there and you were here illegally, then ICE would demand that they detain you.
287G is controversial for a number of reasons. So is ending it. And in doing so, McFadden, a former CMPD officer, asked for people's help.
We have to show Charlotte that this is the step in the right direction, and I need everybody's help to show Charlotte and the nation that we are doing the right thing.
He campaigned on ending this because he said 287G makes the community less safe. How so? What was his reason?
Well, he says that the lack of trust prevents immigrant populations from working with police and sheriffs to report crimes. They are leery of dealing with law enforcement because they're worried about possible deportation.
And of course, ICE has responded by saying, if you won't work with us, we will just have a bigger presence here on our own. ICE Field Office Director Sean Gallagher released a statement saying that it's an open invitation to aliens who commit criminal offenses, that Mecklenburg County is a safe haven. So they're creating this, this fear that they're going to be here re-victimizing people, and said residents should expect a more visible ICE presence in Charlotte, as ICE will now have no choice but to conduct more at-large arrests in local neighborhoods and at work sites.
So Garry McFadden is in that job now because voters chose him over the incumbent Erwin Carmichael, who was very much in favor of 287G and said that it made the community safer. Was that the key issue? Is that why Garry McFadden won, is opposition to 287G?
I think that was one of the reasons he won. I also think he won because of some recent deaths in the county jail. I think a lot of voters, especially in the African American community, were not pleased with communication, the way communication with family members and inmates had been limited, so I think there were a number of reasons. But there was an event last night where Sheriff McFadden said he had received threats since ending this program. And read about the statement from ICE. That was a big concern as well. This was a largely immigrant crowd, and they were very concerned that now that this program is ended, it might provoke ICE to step up its tactics.
And evidently they might do just that. A new county commission comprised of all Democrats was sworn in this week, and they voted in a new chairman, one whose selection broke with tradition. For the first time, they chose a district member, not an at-large member, George Dunlap from District 3. What is the significance of this?
Well, this is a pretty big breaking of precedent because obviously the at-large commissioners run countywide. You have much smaller voting populations in those districts. George Dunlap got about 43,000 votes. By comparison, Pat Cotham, who was the top vote getter, got 242,000 votes.
And the top vote getter traditionally has been the person named to be the commission chairman. And they've broken with that tradition in the past, too, particularly with regard to Pat Cotham.
Yes.
Is there a lot of friction on this board?
I think let's go with yes. Let's go with yes. Certainly, they've only been together a few days, so we can't.
George Dunlap's been on the board.
Yeah,
Pat
right.
Cotham's been on the commission.
Right.
So,
and there's been plenty of friction on recent boards, and you're right. That tradition has been broken several times. It goes back to Jennifer Roberts. She was the top vote getter in 2010, and you'll remember she was ousted midway through her tenure in a deal cut that put Harold Cogdale in as the chair. So this has kind of become a little bit of a fever with the county commission. It's going to be interesting. George Dunlap said to me and others that, look, we all have one vote, so we all have the same power and influence, and he promised to be out and about in the county and not just stick to his district. So that's kind of his pitch.
Well, there was some criticism about his potential leadership abilities. Why?
Well, there's been tension on the board, and the Observer editorial went back to. I'm pointing to Steve. He's at WFAE. Sorry, the Observer editorial this week went back to his 10-day suspension for hitting a female officer, as an example. Colette Forrest, who was the head of the Black Political Caucus, told me this week that she felt he was often disrespectful to her and other females. So it is interesting, given that this is an election viewed by many as one driven by women in terms of who was elected.
Right.
And you have three freshman women who are on the county commission.
One of whom, Elaine Powell, was chosen to be vice chair. How unusual is that for a brand new person on the board to be the vice chair?
Yeah, all of this is unusual. This is a little bit of a not unprecedented, but what George Dunlap's piece is. But this is a different looking county commission, and it all starts with the fact that you have 9 Democrats and no Republicans. That's the first time since I think 1964. So we have a lot of things at play here.
And to some extent, this is drama that just plays out among those 9 people. But then the reason it would spill over to voters and citizens is if these tensions then spill into, are you going to vote for? George Dunlap supports this. I don't like the way he got to be chairman. Maybe I'm going to try to steer this in a different direction.
Absolutely.
Just after this program left the air last Friday, Honeywell International announced their relocation of their corporate headquarters from New Jersey to Charlotte, bringing more than 750 jobs here that pay around $85,000 a year, maybe more in some cases, maybe less. But they got incentives from the various governments to make this move, and City Councilman Tariq Bakari was on this program this week, and he said he believed that the agreement indicates that we are getting more than we are giving. He called it a good deal that he'd take any day of the week, but he also said he would hold Honeywell's feet to the fire to make sure they deliver what they promised. Otherwise, he'd yank back the incentives. So what are the particulars of this deal?
So combined, they are getting over $80 million worth of incentives. That's, I think,
42 from the state and I think 46 from the city and county combined.
The way that these incentives work, both on the state and local level, is that a portion of payroll tax money is rebated to the company. So the argument in favor of these incentives from business leaders and from politicians who support incentives is that none of this is paid out until the payroll and the jobs are being generated.
Well, 3 years ago, Honeywell was looking to move away from their home in New Jersey, and New Jersey forked over a $40 million tax credit for them to stay. Was that $40 million tax credit for just 3 years? It was only 3 years ago, or are they reneging on that deal up there?
Well, I don't know the New Jersey law, but I can tell you a lot of states have clawback provisions. That's what happened in the case of Chiquita. They received incentives when they came to North Carolina, and then they left early, and they had to pay back the state of North Carolina some of the money that they had been given to come here. So incentives remained very controversial, and it is interesting. I think everyone around this table has been to these announcements, and invariably the governor, the mayor, whoever it is says, it's a great deal for us, we don't like incentives, but we have to do it because everybody else does it. And that's kind of the spiel you hear again and again and again.
I was going to say, I think one thing that's interesting is, the city council had that election last year. They brought in all the new candidates, kind of these, like all the millennials, this new guard, promising a lot of change. And in terms of incentives, there has been no daylight between them and the old group. It is yes, 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 yes on all of them. I just think that's kind of a...
The other thing I want to mention real quickly is it is notable that the county is kicking in, they described it as more than $28 million. Usually the city is more aggressive with incentives than county government. I don't have an explanation for that yet, but it is noteworthy.
Okay. The House Committee, the North Carolina House Committee studying school safety, and issued their report this week, and they embarked on this because of Parkland, Florida, the shooting there. What did they conclude? What's in the report?
Well, they came out with a list of final recommendations that they will send to the House. Those include statewide mental health screening to identify students who might be in danger of harming themselves or others. It requires first aid training for all students, including how to stop bleeding in a trauma situation, which there have been some furrowed brows about the idea of teaching, elementary school kids how to staunch bleeding. There's a requirement for civic responsibility education that includes respect for personnel and responsibility for school safety. What there is not, as many people have noted, is anything about restricting access to guns.
Wow. What are we to take from this?
Well, what the House members who are involved in this are saying is this is the first bite at the apple. We took some things that we could deal with. This doesn't mean we can't come back to other gun safety issues. In fact, one of the recommendations is to continue and or expand this to include the Senate and to keep looking at school safety.
Meanwhile, the Municipal Education Advisory Committee,
MEAC.
Or MEAC.
Yeah, you should hear Clayton Wilcox pronounce it. It's like hacking up a hairball. MEAC. We have our new acronym. I don't think he likes that new acronym.
I'm not sure he likes the group. They held their first meeting this week. Why were they formed? Remind us about that.
Well, this is the latest development in basically years of tension between the suburbs and CMS, in which many of the suburban elected officials say, our problems are extreme, the school board is overlooking them, they're all about Charlotte. So they all sat down at the same table and they all looked at a bunch of data that was related to the tax base and growth projections. They're going to look at school crowding.
But this is a way to be more open and transparent so that the ring cities, the Matthews and the Mint Hills and the Huntersville, won't start their own charters or maybe think twice before they do. Is that essentially?
That is. And three of those cities, Huntersville, Matthews, and Mint Hill, have also created their own educational task forces, which are independently looking at their options. But I think what CMS hopes is that they'll all look at this and say, wow, we can work together with CMS. We really support our countywide public school system. We see our needs in the context of everybody else's needs.
So you know the players, at least some of them, and you know the tensions that have been rising over the years. Can this group diffuse those tensions, lessen the impression among towns that they need to take steps toward starting their own charter schools, or are these meetings likely to act as a way of greasing the wheels toward an exit?
I don't know that they would grease the wheels. I also don't know that it can completely obliterate all these tensions. I mean, there's always, charter schools are a fact of life. The municipal charter schools are a unique twist that has people concerned in a lot of ways, but there's still going to be charter schools opening in the suburbs, in Charlotte. There are still, they've
but these are different charter schools because these would be run by the municipalities.
And the big thing is that they could offer seating for people within their municipalities, which is very different. Other charter schools don't have a zone. You have to take anybody who wants to apply and can get in. So
they can prioritize.
Right.
Prioritize,
so
right.
How often is this MEAC meeting?
They are required to meet at least once a quarter, but their next meeting will be in January, and it will be in Cornelius, which I think is an important thing that they're saying they're going to get out, because if you just say come into uptown Charlotte, that sends that message again that we're not serious about you.
It's the local news roundup on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Silent Sam's statue on the campus at UNC Chapel Hill fell a couple of months ago. It's been in storage awaiting its fate. This week, university leaders made a suggestion about that fate. And that is how some protesters on the Chapel Hill campus reacted to that decision. Chancellor Carol Folt presented the plan, which was overwhelmingly approved by the campus trustees. Where do they want this statue to go?
In a new museum, a $5 million museum that I think would cost about $800,000 a year to operate. And that did not placate opponents of Silent Sam. Would that be a mild understatement?
It also didn't placate one of the Board of Governors members, Tom Goolsbee, who posted a video on YouTube, who called the Board of Trustees plan sheer cowardice. Why? Because he wants it back on the pedestal in the middle of the quad? Is that what he wants?
I think so. I actually think they were trying to do the right thing. We often hear that. We often hear critics say that these statues belong in museums, or they shouldn't be displayed on the public square. I think they were probably trying to address that, but in doing so, building this $5 million facility or whatever, it almost made it sound that they were building a monument to it, and that's certainly how some people saw it.
Well, and the obvious solution would be to put it in a truck and send it to the North Carolina Museum of History, to the Levine Museum of the New South. It could be part of a very powerful exhibit, but state law doesn't let them take it off the campus. So instead what they're saying is, we're going to go to this, the Odom
can't
Village.
Change the law?
They can't. Legislators can.
And there's no appetite for that, given what's going on?
Doesn't seem to be.
Certainly no one has stood up and said, I would like to change this.
I mean, would you put yourself in the middle? This is the classic
Right.
definition of a no-win situation. They've been just bombarded. The News and Observer got 2,000 pages of emails with people, everybody offering emphatic solutions that are completely at odds with the others.
Okay, well, we'll keep our eye on that. Julius Peppers, the Carolina Panthers defensive end, has been named as the team's nominee for the 2018 Walter Payton Man of the Year Award. We'll keep our eye on that going forward. We'll keep our eye on the game this weekend, or maybe not, given their record. And we're going to be taking this program, the local news roundup, on the road next Friday. You're invited to join us for the live show at 7th Street Public Market in Uptown from 9 to 10. We're not going any longer than that, just the normal time. More details at wfae.org/Charlotte Talks, and we hope to see you there. Steve Harrison, Doss Helms, Glenn Burkins, Erik Spanberg, thank you all for the hour.